The first time they tried to throw her out of the courthouse, she was 15 years old and carrying a bucket of dying flowers. The marble halls of Manhattan Supreme Court echoed with expensive shoes, low conversations, and the rustle of tailored coats as Claire Bennett stood outside beneath the cold November wind, clutching a dented metal bucket filled with white lilies and red carnations. The flowers were already beginning to wilt from the temperature, but she kept smiling anyway. She had learned a long time ago that people tipped more when you smiled. Yellow taxi cabs crawled through the rain-slick streets while steam rose from the subway grates around her. Claire adjusted the strap of her faded backpack and glanced through the towering courthouse windows again. Lawyers moved through the lobby like they owned the world. Sharp suits, leather briefcases, gold watches catching the light. Every single one of them looked untouchable. Claire lowered her eyes to the cardboard sign hanging from her bucket. Fresh flowers, $5. $5 could buy milk. $10 could keep the lights on another day. $20 meant her little brother wouldn't have to pretend he wasn't hungry before bed again. The courthouse doors suddenly swung open, and a stream of attorneys flooded the front steps. Claire straightened instantly. "Flowers, sir?" "Fresh flowers, ma'am." Most people ignored her. Some barely looked at her face. One woman wrinkled her nose as if poverty had a smell. Claire swallowed the embarrassment and kept smiling anyway. Because rent was due Friday. Because her mother's second job still wasn't enough. Because survival didn't leave room for pride. Then she noticed him. Tall, dark charcoal coat, early 30s, calm blue eyes scanning a stack of legal files while descending the courthouse stairs. Ethan Carter. Claire didn't know his name yet, but she noticed the way everyone else moved aside for him. The young attorney stopped near the curb as a black town car pulled forward. Claire hesitated before stepping closer. "Sir," Ethan glanced up. For one brief second, his eyes met hers. Claire suddenly became aware of everything at once, the rain dripping from her sleeves, the scuffed sneakers peeking beneath her jeans, the cold stinging her fingertips. "Would you like a flower?" she asked softly. Ethan looked down at the lilies. "How much?" $5. Before he could answer, a courthouse security guard appeared behind Claire with an irritated sigh. "Kid, how many times do I have to tell you? You can't stand here blocking the entrance." Claire's shoulders tensed immediately. "I'm not blocking anything," she whispered. "Move along." The guard pointed toward the sidewalk corner. "This place isn't for people like you." The words landed harder than the freezing rain. Claire lowered her eyes, gripping the metal bucket tighter until her knuckles turned white. Around them, nobody stopped walking. Nobody cared. Ethan watched silently as Claire nodded once and stepped away from the courthouse doors. But before she turned completely, her eyes drifted upward toward the massive gold lettering above the entrance. Supreme Court of New York. She stared at the way other girls stared at movie stars, like it meant something impossible, like maybe one day it could belong to her too. The security guard scoffed under his breath and walked back inside. Ethan remained still beside the car. Then something caught his attention. Claire had pulled a folded newspaper from her backpack while standing beneath the awning across the street. Not the comics, not celebrity gossip, the legal section. Rain tapped softly against the pavement as she opened the paper carefully, revealing lines of highlighted text and handwritten notes cramped into the margins. Ethan frowned slightly. The driver opened the car door for him, but he didn't move right away. Across the street, the Flower Girl read court rulings beneath a flickering bus stoplight, as if her entire future depended on understanding every word. And somehow, Ethan Carter had the strange feeling that it actually did. That night, the Bennett apartment smelled faintly of canned soup and laundry detergent as Claire sat cross-legged on the floor beside the radiator with her courthouse newspaper spread across her lap. Outside the cracked window, sirens echoed somewhere downtown while snow began, collecting along the fire escapes. The apartment was barely 600 square feet, but Claire had memorized every sound it made. The pipes knocking after midnight. The kitchen cabinet that never fully closed. The buzzing hallway light outside apartment 4C that flickered like it was too tired to stay alive. Her little brother, Mason, slept on the couch wrapped in 2 blankets, one sock missing from his left foot. Across the room, their mother sat at the kitchen table, rubbing her temples beneath the weak yellow light overhead. 3 unpaid bills rested beside her cold coffee mug. Claire quietly reached in her backpack and pulled out a folded stack of cash. $37. Not enough. Never enough. Her mother looked up immediately. Claire, tell me you did not stay out in that weather again. Claire forced a smile. I sold almost everything. You should be studying. I was. She held up the legal newspaper slightly. During slow traffic. Her mother's expression softened for a moment before exhaustion returned to her face. Honey, reading court cases does not make you a lawyer. Claire looked down at the highlighted article in front of her. A story about tenant rights, eviction laws, housing appeals. The words fascinated her in a way nothing else ever had. Maybe not, she whispered, but it is a start. Her mother sighed quietly and returned to the bills. Claire knew that look. It was the same look adults wore right before pretending everything would somehow work out. But Claire had already figured something out about the world. Hope did not pay electric bills. Work did. The next morning the city was buried beneath freezing rain. Claire stood outside a midtown coffee shop before school, holding a tray of discounted muffins the owner had given her at closing time the night before. She slipped one into Mason's backpack before zipping his coat all the way up. You need to eat lunch today, she told him firmly. Mason looked guilty. I was saving money. Claire crouched in front of him and brushed snow from his hair. That is my job. Your job is school. You sound like Mom. Somebody has to. Mason grinned faintly before running toward the bus stop. Claire watched until he disappeared around the corner. Then she headed downtown with her flower bucket hanging from one arm and a heavy law textbook tucked inside her backpack. The courthouse steps were already crowded when she arrived after classes that afternoon. Men in wool coats rushed through rotating doors while reporters chased interviews beneath flashing cameras. Claire took her usual spot beside the subway railing and started arranging lilies into cleaner bundles. Flowers, fresh flowers. Her voice was softer today. Her fingers were numb from the cold. Across the street, a television inside an electronics store displayed breaking news about a luxury real estate merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Claire barely noticed. She was too busy reading another court article balanced against her flower bucket. You really read those things? A voice asked suddenly. Claire looked up so fast she nearly dropped the paper. Ethan Carter stood in front of her, holding an umbrella dark enough to block the snow collecting around them. Up close, he looked even more intimidating. Expensive watch, perfect coat, calm eyes that missed nothing. Claire straightened awkwardly. Sometimes, Ethan glanced at the highlighted notes scribbled along the margins. Most law students do not take notes that detailed. Claire blinked. I'm not a law student. I know. The wind swept between the buildings, sending freezing air through the avenue. Ethan studied her for another quiet second before reaching into his wallet. He handed her a $20 bill and picked up a single white lily. Claire immediately searched her coat pocket for change. Keep it, he said. Sir, this flower costs $5. Ethan's eyes drifted toward the courthouse entrance behind him. Then consider the other $15 an investment. Before Claire could ask what he meant, Ethan turned and disappeared into the crowd of attorneys climbing the courthouse stairs. Claire stared down at the 20 in her hand while snowflakes melted against the paper. Then slowly, carefully, she opened her lawn newspaper again. By spring, the city no longer felt cold to Claire Bennett. It felt expensive. Every subway ride, every grocery receipt, every overdue notice taped to apartment doors reminded her that New York belonged to people with money. Everyone else simply borrowed space inside it. The courthouse remained the only place that felt different. Strange, impossible, but different. Claire now spent almost every afternoon there after school, selling flowers beside the subway entrance while secretly listening to legal arguments drifting from the courthouse steps. She memorized the rhythm of attorneys the way musicians memorize songs. Confident voices, precise words, calm expressions, even under pressure. Sometimes she practiced opening statements quietly to herself while arranging lilies into cleaner bouquets. Objection, Your Honor. The evidence clearly shows, with all due respect, the phrases felt foreign and magical on her tongue. One rainy Thursday evening, Claire sat beneath the bus stop awning near the courthouse reviewing handwritten notes inside a battered legal textbook she had borrowed from the public library. The book was almost 20 years old. Entire pages were underlined by strangers who had probably become lawyers long ago. Claire traced the faded ink with her fingertips as if success itself had somehow soaked into the paper. Around her, commuters rushed through puddles without noticing the teenage girl still studying after dark with wet sneakers and a flower bucket beside her. Her phone buzzed suddenly. A message from her mother. Landlord came again. Please hurry home. Claire's stomach tightened instantly. She packed her books into her backpack and boarded the downtown train with her unsold flowers balanced carefully on her lap. By the time she reached their apartment building, flashing red eviction notices had been taped across several doors in the hallway. Apartment 4C was one of them. Claire stopped breathing for half a second. Inside the apartment, her mother sat silently at the kitchen table, while Mason pretended to do homework on the couch, even though his pencil had not moved once. The atmosphere felt heavy enough to collapse the walls. Claire slowly peeled the eviction notice from the door and read every line twice. Then a third time. Mom, she said, carefully, did you miss court? Her mother looked ashamed. I cannot get off work. Claire scanned the document again. Hearing date. Tenant response deadline. Filing code. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Something felt wrong. She dropped her backpack onto the floor and immediately opened her old law textbook beside the kitchen sink. Claire, her mother whispered tiredly. Honey, please. Not tonight. But Claire was already flipping pages faster now, comparing statutes to the notice in her hand. Rain tapped against the windows while the radiator hissed softly behind her. Mason watched silently from the couch. Then suddenly Claire stopped turning pages. Her heartbeat quickened. Wait. She grabbed the notice again. This filing date is invalid. Her mother blinked in confusion. What? Claire pointed toward the paper with trembling fingers. The landlord filed the notice before the grace period legally ended. He cannot remove us yet. Silence filled the apartment. Even the radiator seemed quieter. Are you sure? Her mother asked carefully. Claire looked back down at the law book. Tenant Protection Act. Section 238. Her chest tightened with adrenaline. Yes, she whispered. I'm sure. The next morning, Claire skipped lunch and took the subway directly to housing court after school. She stood outside courtroom 12, clutching her mother's paperwork against her chest, while adults in suits rushed around her speaking in exhausted voices. The courthouse smelled like old coffee, wet coats, and stress. Claire's palms sweated so badly, the papers nearly slipped from her hands. She did not belong here. She knew that. Her faded jeans, discount sneakers, and flower bucket leaning beside the bench made that painfully obvious. But when the courtroom doors finally opened, Claire stood anyway. Across the hallway, another attorney stepped out carrying a leather briefcase and speaking quietly into his phone. Ethan Carter stopped mid-sentence the moment he saw her standing outside housing court alone with legal documents in her shaking hands. And for the second time in his life, the flower girl had his full attention. Courtroom 12 was smaller than Claire imagined. The walls were dull beige instead of grand marble, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly like exhausted insects. Folding benches lined both sides of the room, crowded with tenants clutching envelopes, landlords checking watches, and attorneys carrying overstuffed briefcases. Nobody looked hopeful. Claire sat near the back, gripping her mother's paperwork, so tightly the edges bent beneath her fingers. Her flower bucket rested beside her feet with only 3 white lilies left unsold. She kept rereading the filing notice, even though she had already memorized every line. Filing date. Grace period violation. Improper notice procedure. Her stomach twisted painfully. What if she was wrong? What if she misunderstood the law completely? Across the courtroom, a middle-aged landlord in an expensive gray coat laughed quietly with his attorney while reviewing documents. Claire recognized him immediately. Mr. Holloway, owner of their apartment building. He looked relaxed, confident, like the outcome had already been decided before anyone entered the room. Claire suddenly became aware of how young she looked sitting there alone. Too young, too poor, too invisible. Case 48. Bennett versus Holloway Properties. Claire's heartbeat slammed against her ribs. She stood so quickly the flower bucket nearly tipped over. Several people turned to stare as she approached the front table, carrying papers that trembled visibly in her hands. The landlord's attorney frowned immediately. "And you are?" Claire swallowed hard. "Claire Bennett, representing my mother." A few quiet chuckles drifted through the courtroom. Someone near the back whispered, "Kid cannot even be 18. Heat rushed into Claire's face, but she forced herself not to look away. The judge adjusted his glasses slowly. "Miss Bennett, are you currently enrolled in law school?" "No, Your Honor." "Do you have legal representation assisting you today?" Claire shook her head once. "No, sir." Another amused laugh echoed softly somewhere behind her. The landlord's attorney leaned back confidently in his chair. "Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Failure to pay rent within the required time frame." Claire's fingers tightened. Around her documents. "That is not true." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. The attorney barely glanced at her. "The tenant received proper notice under New York housing procedure." Claire inhaled slowly. Then she opened her worn legal textbook beside the table. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and highlighted passages. "Section 238, she said carefully, forcing her voice steadier this time. The notice was filed before the legal grace period expired. Silence flickered briefly across the courtroom. The attorney smirked. "That is a misunderstanding of procedural timing." Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. "No, sir." She pointed directly toward the filing date. The notice was submitted 48 hours early. The judge reached for the document immediately. The room grew still except for the rustling papers beneath his hands. Claire could barely breathe. Across the courtroom, the landlord's attorney suddenly looked less comfortable. The judge examined the notice another moment before looking up slowly. "Miss Bennett is correct." A sharp silence spread through the room. Claire blinked once, almost unable to process the words. "This filing violates the required tenant response timeline." The judge continued calmly. "The eviction notice is invalid." The landlord's attorney stiffened. "Your Honor, dismissed." Claire stood frozen while conversations quietly erupted around the benches. A woman near the back stared openly in disbelief. Someone else whispered, "How did she catch that?" The landlord shot Claire an irritated glare before storming toward the exit with his attorney close behind. Claire slowly gathered her papers with trembling fingers, barely noticing that her hands were shaking uncontrollably now. She had done it. Somehow, she had actually done it. "Miss Bennett." Claire looked up instantly. Ethan Carter stood near the courtroom doors watching her with an unreadable expression. Dark coat, calm eyes, controlled posture. Yet something about his face had changed. Not pity, not amusement. Respect. Real respect. Ethan glanced briefly at the legal textbook under her arm. Most first-year law students would have missed that filing. Error. Claire stared at him speechless. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "Tell me something honestly." His eyes settled on the stack of handwritten notes sticking from her textbook. "Who taught you how to do this?" Claire looked down at the worn pages covered in highlighter ink and cramped midnight handwriting. Then quietly, almost embarrassed by the truth, she answered, "Nobody." The rain had stopped by the time Claire stepped out of housing court, but the city still glistened beneath layers of gray afternoon light. Steam drifted from the sidewalks while taxis splashed through puddles along Center Street. Claire held her legal textbook tightly against her chest, as if someone might suddenly take it away from her. Her pulse still had not settled. She could barely believe what happened inside that courtroom. People had listened to her. For the first time in her life, powerful people had actually listened. "Miss Bennett." Ethan Carter caught up beside her near the courthouse steps, one hand tucked inside his coat pocket. Claire immediately straightened. Up close, he always seemed strangely calm compared to the chaos of the city around him. "You never answer my question," he said. Claire looked down briefly. "I told you. Nobody taught me." Ethan studied her face carefully, almost like he was trying to solve something complicated. Then where did you learn housing procedure? Claire gave a small shrug. Library books, court transcripts online, old legal newspapers. Ethan blinked once. You taught yourself tenant law using public records? Mostly. The corner of his mouth shifted slightly, not quite a smile. That is either impressive or concerning. Claire laughed nervously before she could stop herself. Ethan noticed immediately. How old are you? 19. Ethan looked genuinely surprised by that. Claire suddenly became aware again of her wet sleeves, faded backpack, and flower bucket beside her feet. Compared to him, she looked like a child pretending to belong near grown-up conversations. Ethan glanced toward the lilies still resting in her bucket. How many hours do you work every week? Claire hesitated. Depends. Meaning too. Many. She looked away toward the traffic. People do what they have to do. For a second, neither of them spoke. The sounds of Manhattan swirled around them endlessly. Car horns, sirens, footsteps. Somewhere nearby, a street musician played soft jazz beneath the subway entrance. Then Ethan reached into his coat and handed her a simple white business card. Carter and Vale, LLP. Gold lettering. Expensive paper. Claire stared at it carefully. I know a scholarship director at Columbia Pre-Law, Ethan said. I could recommend you. Claire looked up immediately, guarded now. Why? Ethan seemed mildly surprised by the question. Because you are talented. You barely know me. I know enough. Claire lowered her eyes to the business card again. Everything about it felt dangerous somehow. People like Ethan Carter lived in worlds that did not overlap with hers. Wealthy attorneys did not notice girls selling flowers outside courthouses. And when they did, there was usually a reason. I do not need charity, she said quietly. Ethan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. That courtroom was not charity. Claire tightened her grip on the card. Still, Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more than she expected. All right. He stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice. Then earn it. Claire frowned faintly. Ethan continued. Come work at Carter and Vale 3 nights a week after school. Filing documents. Organizing case records. Nothing glamorous. Claire stared at him in disbelief. You are offering me a job? Temporary internship. I'm not qualified. Ethan glanced toward the courthouse doors behind them. Neither was half the city when they started. Claire almost smiled despite herself. Almost. Ethan checked his watch briefly before looking back at her one final time. 7 o'clock tomorrow night. If you are serious about law, be there. Then he walked down the courthouse stairs toward a waiting black car without another word. Claire stood frozen beneath the fading evening light while the business card trembled faintly between her fingers. Across the street, the courthouse windows reflected gold against the wet pavement like something unreal. She looked down at the lilies inside her bucket. Then slowly she pulled out her old pocket notebook and wrote 3 careful words beneath tonight's date. Carter and Vale. A cold wind swept through the avenue, lifting strands of hair across her face. For the first time in years, Claire Bennett felt something stronger than fear pressing against her chest. Possibility. The lobby of Carter and Vale looked nothing like the courthouse waiting rooms Claire was used to. Everything inside the midtown skyscraper gleamed under soft amber, lighting polished marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers, and quiet jazz floated through hidden ceiling speakers. Men and women in tailored suits crossed the lobby carrying leather portfolios that probably cost more than her family's monthly rent. Claire stood frozen just inside the revolving doors, clutching her backpack strap so tightly her knuckles hurt. Her reflection in the glass walls made her feel painfully out of place. Discount black slacks, white blouse from a thrift store, sneakers she had scrubbed clean 3 times before coming. A security guard near the reception desk looked her over briefly before asking, "Can I help you?" Claire swallowed. "I'm here for the internship. Ethan Carter." Even saying his name aloud felt strange. The receptionist typed something quickly before her expression changed. 27th floor. Mr. Carter is expecting you. The elevator ride felt endless. Claire watched the city rise beneath her through the glass walls as Manhattan transformed into glittering rooftops and rivers of headlights. Somewhere below, people still rushed through subway stations and street corners carrying groceries home in the cold. Somewhere below, her mother was finishing another double shift. Somewhere below, Mason was probably microwaving canned soup for dinner. The elevator doors opened silently onto the executive floor. Carter in Vale was quieter than a church at night. Soft carpet muted footsteps, while framed legal awards lined the walls beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Claire barely had time to absorb everything before a sharp voice cut through the silence. "You are the flower girl." Claire turned. Immediately, a tall woman in an expensive navy suit stood beside the reception area, holding several legal folders against one arm. Blonde hair, perfectly styled. Diamond earrings. Cold eyes. "Excuse me," Claire asked carefully. The woman glanced toward Claire's backpack and worn notebook with open skepticism. "You sell flowers outside the courthouse." It was not a question. Claire straightened slightly. "Sometimes." The woman gave a humorless smile. "Interesting hiring strategy." Before Claire could answer, Ethan stepped out from a nearby office. "Margaret." The woman turned toward him instantly. "You hired a teenager with no credentials?" Ethan remained calm. "Claire is here to work." Margaret Holloway looked Claire over one final time before speaking directly to Ethan again. "This is a law firm, not a charity program." The words hit Claire harder than she expected. Ethan's expression cooled immediately. "Then it is fortunate I did not ask your permission." Silence settled heavily between them. Margaret gave a small, dismissive laugh before walking away in sharp, clicking heels. Claire stared down at the floor, embarrassment burning through her chest. "You do not have to do this," she said quietly once Margaret disappeared. Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You are considering leaving because one arrogant attorney made a rude comment?" Claire forced a shrug. "People like her are usually right." Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "No. People like her are usually loud." Claire looked up slowly. Ethan handed her a stack of case files. "Conference room B. Organize these by hearing date." Claire blinked in surprise at the sudden shift. "That is it. Did you expect fireworks?" Despite herself, Claire laughed softly. Ethan noticed again. The smallest reactions from her always seemed genuine in a world filled with rehearsed smiles. Hours passed quietly inside the conference room, while Claire organized files beneath warm desk lamps overlooking the city. Housing disputes, tenant appeals, eviction hearings, real lives hidden inside paper folders. Every once in a while, Ethan stopped by to review her work. At first, Claire barely spoke, but little by little, the silence between them became easier. Around 11:30 that night, Ethan entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Claire was asleep at the conference table with legal notes scattered around her folded arms. A yellow highlighter still rested loosely in her fingers. Ethan stopped walking. Her face looked younger while sleeping. Exhausted. Fragile. Yet beside her open notebook were 3 full pages of handwritten observations about tenant procedure errors she noticed inside the case files. Ethan slowly placed the coffee cups down without waking her. Then his eyes landed on something written carefully at the top of her notebook page. "One day, I will belong here." Ethan stared at the sentence for a long, quiet moment while Manhattan glowed beyond the windows behind her like an entirely different universe waiting just outside reach. Summer arrived slowly in Manhattan, wrapping the city in humid nights and golden reflections across skyscraper windows. Claire Bennett now spent nearly every evening at Carter and Vale after finishing classes and selling flowers outside the courthouse. Somewhere between filing tenant appeals and organizing deposition records, the law firm had started feeling less intimidating. Not comfortable exactly, but possible. She learned which elevators moved fastest during rush hour, which partners ignored interns completely, which vending machine on the 23rd floor stole dollar bills. And every night, long after most attorneys left, one office light always remained on. Ethan Carter's. Claire sat cross-legged at the conference room table, surrounded by open legal binders while rain rolled softly against the windows outside. Midnight had passed almost an hour ago. Her highlighter moved quickly across pages filled with zoning disputes and housing violations. "You missed dinner again." Claire looked up immediately. Ethan stood in the doorway, loosening his tie slightly, while holding a white paper bag from a deli downstairs. Claire blinked. "I was busy." Ethan walked over and placed the bag beside her notebook. "That is not an acceptable food group." Claire opened the bag carefully. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, chocolate chip cookie. The warmth rising from the paper almost made her emotional. "Almost. You do realize interns are not supposed to be fed this well," she said softly. Ethan sat across from her with the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes. "You also realize interns are not supposed to rewrite half the housing research summaries better than junior associates." Claire looked down immediately, embarrassed. "I was only fixing grammar." "You corrected legal reasoning." Claire bit back a smile. Silence settled comfortably between them after that. Outside, the city glowed silver beneath the rain, while distant sirens echoed through the avenues below. Claire carefully unwrapped half the sandwich. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan leaned back slightly. "You usually do anyway." "Why tenant law?" Ethan seemed mildly surprised by the question. He glanced toward the windows for a long moment before answering. "When I was 13, my father lost everything after his business collapsed." Claire blinked. That was not the answer she expected. "We moved 3 times in 1 year." Ethan continued quietly. "I still remember watching my mother pretend eviction notices were not terrifying." Claire stared at him carefully now. For the first time since meeting him, he sounded less like a powerful attorney and more like a person carrying old memories he rarely touched. "What happened after that?" she asked softly. Ethan gave a faint shrug. "I got older." Something about the answer made Claire's chest tighten unexpectedly. She understood that kind of survival, the kind where childhood quietly disappeared before anyone noticed. Ethan looked back toward the files spread across the table. "Most people in this city think poverty is laziness," he said, "usually because they have never been close enough to see the difference." Claire lowered her eyes slowly. "People look at me like I already failed before I even speak." Ethan's expression sharpened slightly. "Then make them regret underestimating you." The words settled heavily inside her chest. Stronger than encouragement. Stronger than sympathy. Belief. Real belief. Before Claire could respond, voices echoed from the hallway outside. Laughter. Expensive heels. Clicking against marble. Ethan's expression shifted immediately. "Stay here a minute." Claire frowned faintly as he stepped into the hallway. Through the glass conference room walls, she saw Margaret Holloway approaching with several senior partners after what looked like a corporate dinner event. Their conversation stopped the moment Margaret noticed Claire sitting inside the conference room surrounded by legal documents. Her eyes narrowed instantly. "She is still here." Claire could hear every word through the partially open door. One of the older partners looked confused. "Who?" Margaret folded her arms coldly. "The courthouse flower girl Ethan brought in." Heat rushed into Claire's face immediately. Another partner glanced through the glass toward Claire with polite confusion. Margaret continued before anyone could answer. "I simply think appearances matter. Clients do not exactly enjoy seeing scholarship projects wandering executive floors after midnight." Silence followed. Claire stared down at the sandwich in front of her, unable to move. Then Ethan's voice cut through the hallway calm and controlled. "Interesting." Margaret arched one brow. Ethan stepped slightly closer. "Because from what I have seen lately, Claire Bennett works harder than half the associates billing 6 figures in this building." The hallway fell silent. Completely silent. Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward the glass walls, just as Ethan turned slightly toward her conference room. And for one impossible second, she realized he meant every single word. By the time Autumn returned to New York, Claire Bennett no longer sold flowers every day outside the courthouse. Only on weekends now, mostly out of habit. Mostly because part of her still could not believe her life was changing. Carter in Vale had become her second home in ways she never expected. She attended evening pre-law classes through a scholarship Ethan quietly arranged without ever mentioning his involvement. She studied until 2 in the morning most nights. She memorized case law on subway rides. She survived on coffee, determination, and the terrifying fear of losing everything if she slowed down for even 1 second. But, little by little, people inside the firm had started noticing her. Junior associates asked for her research notes. Secretaries saved legal journals for her before throwing them away. Even a few partners nodded politely when she passed through the hallways now. All except Margaret Holloway. Claire stepped into the executive conference room, carrying deposition files, one chilly October evening when she realized something was wrong immediately. The atmosphere felt tense. Senior attorneys sat around the long glass table reviewing documents while a giant projection screen displayed photographs of apartment buildings across Brooklyn. Ethan stood near the front, speaking calmly beside a stack of evidence binders. Claire quietly placed the files near the doorway, intending to leave unnoticed. Then she heard the address, 145 Brighton Avenue. Her stomach dropped instantly. That was her building. Tenants claim management ignored heating violations for nearly 8 months, one attorney said. Margaret sighed impatiently. The settlement offer is already generous. Claire froze beside the door. Ethan flipped through another report. The violations are documented. Margaret folded her arms. These cases happen constantly. People exaggerate conditions when money is involved. Claire felt heat rising slowly into her chest. Images flashed through her mind instantly. Mason sleeping in his winter coat during January because the radiator stopped working. Her mother boiling water on the stove for warmth. Elderly neighbors wrapping towels beneath apartment doors to block freezing drafts. They are not exaggerating. The words escaped before Claire realized she spoke aloud. The entire room turned toward her immediately. Claire's pulse exploded. Margaret stared coldly. "Excuse me." Claire swallowed hard but stepped forward anyway. "I live there." Silence settled heavily across the conference room. Ethan watched her carefully without interrupting. Claire continued quietly. The heating system failed constantly. Pipes leaked through ceilings. The landlord ignored complaints for months. Margaret leaned back in her chair with visible irritation. And now our intern suddenly becomes an expert witness. Claire's cheeks burned. "No, I just know what it felt like." Margaret gave a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Feelings are not legal evidence." Ethan's expression darkened slightly. Claire looked down briefly before speaking again, softer this time. "Maybe not, but freezing families are still real, even when wealthy people call them exaggerations." The room went silent again. One older partner slowly removed his glasses. Another attorney quietly closed her laptop. Nobody looked amused anymore. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan spoke first. "Claire." She looked at him immediately. Ethan held out one of the evidence folders toward her. "Show them the maintenance records you flagged last week." Claire blinked in surprise. Then slowly she stepped closer to the table and opened the file with trembling hands. Her fingers found the highlighted pages instantly. The repair requests were altered after submission dates, she explained carefully. Several tenant complaints disappeared entirely from the official logs. One attorney frowned. "Can you prove that?" Claire nodded once. "The archived copies do not match the submitted exhibits." Silence spread through the room again, but this time it felt different. Focused. Serious. Ethan watched Claire explain the discrepancies beside the glowing city skyline, while every senior attorney at the table listened to her. Really listened. And somewhere deep inside her chest, something shifted forever. Because for the first time in her entire life, Claire Bennett was no longer standing outside the courthouse looking in. She was finally inside the room where powerful people made decisions. And they were paying attention to every word she said. 7 years later, the courthouse looked exactly the same. The marble columns still towered over Center Street. Yellow taxis still flooded the avenue every morning. Lawyers still rushed through the revolving doors, clutching coffee cups and expensive briefcases while reporters crowded the front steps, chasing headlines. But Claire Bennett was no longer standing outside with a flower bucket in her freezing hands. Cameras flashed wildly as a black town car pulled to the curb. Beneath the courthouse entrance, journalists surged forward immediately. "Claire, over here. How does it feel becoming the youngest attorney in city history to win a class action housing case? Is it true the settlement will impact over 12,000 tenants?" Claire stepped from the car, wearing a dark navy suit tailored perfectly to her frame. Her hair rested softly against her shoulders while silver courthouse lights reflected across the glass doors behind her. Calm, composed, unrecognizable from the girl she used to be. Yet as she climbed the courthouse steps, one familiar voice suddenly stopped her. "Miss Bennett." Claire turned instantly. The old security guard from years ago stood near the entrance staring at her in disbelief. Older now, grayer, but unmistakably the same man. His eyes widened slowly. "You are the flower girl." Silence settled between them while reporters continued shouting questions nearby. Claire looked at him for a long moment before smiling softly. "I used to be." Something shifted across the old guard's face then. Embarrassment, maybe. Regret. He stepped aside immediately and opened the courthouse doors for her himself. "Welcome back, counselor." Claire paused for half a second before walking inside. The marble lobby echoed beneath her heels exactly the way she once imagined during cold afternoons selling flowers outside those same doors. Except now, people moved out of her way. Now people recognized her name. Courtroom 12 overflowed with tenants, reporters, attorneys, and city officials waiting for the final approval hearing of the largest housing rights settlement New York had seen in decades. Families who once feared eviction now filled the benches holding hands and whispering nervous prayers beneath fluorescent courtroom lights. Claire stood at the front table, reviewing her final notes, while adrenaline surged beneath her calm expression. Across the courtroom, Ethan Carter watched her quietly beside the rear wall. Time had changed both of them. Claire was no longer the frightened teenager, teaching herself law from discarded newspapers. Ethan was no longer the distant attorney observing her from courthouse steps. Somewhere along the way, they had become something stronger, partners in every way that mattered. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Silence fell. Claire stepped forward when her name was called. For one brief second, her eyes drifted toward the courtroom doors. Same beige walls, same hard benches, same room where nobody took her seriously years ago. Then she began speaking, calmly, clearly, powerfully. Every sentence carried the weight of nights spent studying beneath flickering subway lights. Every argument carried memories of freezing apartments and overdue notices taped to doors. By the time she finished, several tenants in the gallery were openly crying. The judge adjusted his glasses slowly before delivering the final ruling. Approved. The courtroom erupted instantly. Gasps, tears, applause. Claire closed her eyes for one overwhelming second as relief crashed through her chest. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of tenants waited beneath the afternoon sunlight for news. The moment Claire emerged through the courthouse doors, cheers exploded across the plaza. Reporters surged forward again while cameras flashed nonstop around her. Yet through all the noise, Claire only noticed one thing. Ethan stood near the bottom of the courthouse stairs holding a single white lily in his hand. The same flower she once sold outside these doors for $5. Claire walked toward him slowly while the city roared around them. Ethan held the lily out carefully. "I think this belongs to the best attorney in New York now." Claire laughed softly through tears she could no longer hide. Ethan studied her face for a quiet moment